Picture this, a foggy English morning in the 1800s. The marketplace buzzes with chatter. Traders shout over each other. Horses snort in the cold air, and coins clink from hand to hand. But at the center of this noisy chaos, there's something different. Something horrifying. A woman stands on a wooden platform. A rough rope, the kind used for cattle, is looped around her neck. She isn't a criminal, not a thief. She's a wife. And she's about to be sold. People laugh and whisper. Some sip ale, others point and jeer. Children hide behind their fathers' coats, peeking curiously. The husband steps forward, chest puffed out, and shouts, "Who'll buy my wife?" The crowd roars, and just like that, her life becomes a public transaction. To us today it sounds barbaric. But in 19th century England, wife-selling was real. It wasn't a myth, nor an exaggeration. It was an unofficial tradition among the working class, a twisted mix of poverty, desperation, and survival. And back then, divorce was nearly impossible unless you were rich. Legal separation could cost more than an entire year's income. So ordinary men and women, trapped in miserable marriages, created their own grim solution. They turned marriage into a marketplace. But it wasn't always about greed or cruelty. More often it was about desperation. Imagine being a poor woman, married to a violent drunk who spends every penny. The law says you belong to him, body, money, even your children. You can't leave, you can't work, you can't breathe freely, so what could you do? Some women found a way out by arranging their own sale. It was humiliating, yes, but it was also their only path to freedom. By standing on that platform, they could be transferred to another man, maybe someone kinder, someone they actually loved. In one case, witnesses described a woman standing tall, her eyes cold but steady. Her hands were bound, her heart racing, but she wasn't broken. She was performing. Because wife-selling was never just punishment. It was theater, a performance of legitimacy. The crowd believed that if the sale happened publicly, it must be fair. And in that twisted sense of justice, both husband and wife could walk away with their heads high, or at least pretending to. Take the story of Mary Ann Price from 1837. Her husband, a coal miner, led her into the marketplace with a rope around her waist. But this wasn't a random sale. The man who bought her, Lewis, was her lover. In front of hundreds, he paid a few shillings, took her hand, and they walked away together. Legally married in the eyes of no one, but free in the eyes of everyone who mattered to them. Was it shameful? Absolutely. But for Mary Ann, that humiliation was the price of freedom. Others weren't so lucky. In 1832, in Carlisle, a woman refused to be sold. She shouted, fought back, refused every bidder. The crowd turned on her, laughing and booing. Even her husband tried to force her forward. The scene turned violent, and it took a magistrate to stop the chaos. That day revealed something ugly about society. Even when the law saw women as property, people still wanted to believe it was their choice. If a wife smiled and accepted her sale, it looked civilized. But if she resisted, it shattered the illusion. So they demanded her silence. Historians have uncovered hundreds of stories like these, from Yorkshire to Cornwall. Sometimes wives were sold for a few coins, sometimes for a mug of ale. In one bizarre case, a man exchanged his wife for a greyhound. Sometimes the buyer promised to care for her and her children. But most of the time, the children were left behind, watching in confusion as their mother walked away with a stranger. Imagine that, the last image a child has of his mother, a rope around her neck. To modern minds, this sounds unthinkable. But back then, it made a horrifying kind of sense. Under English common law, a wife was her husband's property. She couldn't own land, earn money, or even keep her own clothes without his permission. She existed legally only through him. So when a husband sold his wife, there was no law to stop him. And as long as the sale was public, society simply pretended it was acceptable. It was cruelty, disguised as custom. Even the rope, the halter, carried symbolism. Just as cattle were transferred with a rope, the wife's halter represented her transfer of ownership. It gave the act a sense of ritual, like signing a contract only made of humiliation and rope. In some towns, the halter even became part of local jokes. But behind every joke was a woman's broken dignity. One of the most disturbing cases happened in Sheffield in 1842. A woman was sold 3 times in one day. Each buyer backed out, forcing her to step onto the platform again and again, facing laughter and mockery. By sunset, she broke down in tears. But the newspaper that covered the story called it an amusing spectacle. Not a word about her pain, only entertainment. That was how Victorian society viewed suffering, as something to watch, not to stop. By the mid-1800s, change began to stir. Britain's new middle class, proud of their morality, started condemning these sales as barbaric. Preachers called it a sin. Newspapers called it a stain on England's soul. But in the backstreets of industrial towns where poverty still ruled, the practice survived. Hidden, whispered, laughed off as old custom. It wasn't until the 1860s that authorities began arresting men for wife selling. The buyers could be charged too, under adultery or indecency laws. Still, it didn't disappear completely. The last known case was in Leeds, in 1913, when a man claimed to have sold his wife to a co-worker for £1,000. By then, the crowd wasn't laughing anymore. They were disgusted, and that moment marked the final breath of a tradition that had haunted England for centuries. So, why did this continue for so long? Because it wasn't just about marriage, it was about power and poverty. For poor families, marriage was a survival pact. When that pact failed, selling a wife was like resetting the balance. It freed the man of responsibility and gave the woman a strange form of social permission to start over. Everyone pretended it was fair, because facing the truth was harder. But the emotional cost was enormous. The women who endured these markets weren't weak, they were survivors. They played the only cards the world allowed them. Some found peace, others more pain. But all of them carried invisible scars that no crowd ever saw. By the early 20th century, as industrialization spread and education grew, the practice faded away. Women gained the right to earn, to own, to speak. Divorce became legal and accessible. The halters disappeared. The markets turned into modern streets. But the echoes remained, in the way society still judges women for leaving, for speaking, for surviving. Because wife selling wasn't just a grotesque curiosity of history, it was a mirror. It reflected a system where power belonged to one side and silence to the other. Even today, that imbalance exists. In forced marriages, human trafficking, and the quiet ways poverty still traps women. When we look back at those markets, at the crowds laughing as a woman stood trembling on a platform, we shouldn't just see barbarism. We should see a warning. Cruelty never vanishes. It only changes shape. The women who wore those ropes were not symbols of shame. They were symbols of resistance. They stood before jeering crowds, humiliated but unbroken. Their courage cracked the foundation of a system built to control them. And through those cracks, the light of progress slowly began to shine. The halters are gone now, but the questions they raised still haunt us. How much is a human life worth? And who gets to decide?